Today, we introduce the samurai. So, where we left off, we had an imperial court in Heian, modern-day Kyoto, that was leading this golden age of art, culture, and literature. But real power was increasingly flowing to the countryside and was controlled by the heads of these powerful clans, like the Fujiwara, the Taira, and, most importantly for today, the Minamoto. These aristocrats generally resented the Taika reforms, which slowly but surely began to sinify the Chinese government, and they especially resented the emphasis on Chinese-style bureaucrats, which sort of helped the emperor rule the country. First great clan were the Fujiwara, who, as we already talked about, intermarried with the imperial family. Why suck up to the boss when you can just, marry into the boss's family, I suppose. But if you remember, the Fujiwara clan becomes the power behind the throne, and they become responsible for, air quotes, protecting the emperor. So these aristocratic families dominate the Japanese government and begin to manage not only large estates, but also large armies. One thing you have to ask yourself is, in an island state that is more or less unified under the emperor's rule, what in the world do you need armies for? If you said potential civil war, you would be correct. Many Taira and Minamoto aristocrats become bushi, which is basically a term that we use for warlords, local military commanders, that kind of thing. Kind of what we saw during the Warring States period of China, but in Chinese history, that's kind of the exception, whereas in Japanese history, it's just Tuesday. It's kind of the norm. One thing that I'll also mention, though, is that for those of you who obsess over katanas and probably play games like Shogun Total War or, any number of Japanese samurai games, the reality is that these are not samurai yet. Japanese armies were actually incredibly poorly trained. Most of them were just sort of mass peasant levies, partially because, again, there weren't really any conspicuous external threats to justify large standing armies that were around on a permanent basis. Briefly, back to how much aristocrats hate the Confucian fad. You actually have this weird alliance between aristocrats and Buddhists who basically create sort of an elite cult within Buddhism that rivals Confucianism and is there really directly to target target Confucianism. By the 11th and 12th centuries, these feudal warlords have seen their power increase significantly. At the same time, the emperor's power decreases significantly. It's kind of a zero-sum game there. And really, like we said, aristocrats are in control of the imperial court, starting with the Fujiwara clan, but of course, that's just sort of the first of many. The emperor really at this period becomes a figurehead, and he will more or less remain a figurehead until really the Meiji Restoration, which, by the way, is not going to be for like another... Well, it's in the 1800s, so roughly, 800 years-ish? Or 600 years. Sorry, I can't math on the fly. So, what happens is that in 1180 to 1185, there's basically this civil war between two powerful families, the Taira and the Minamoto clan. Ultimately, the Minamoto clan emerges victorious, and they establish control over the imperial court. When I say, by the way, the emperor is a figurehead, what that basically means is that he sort of conducts a lot of the religious rites. It's not incorrect to kind of think of him as this sort of Pope-like figure, but almost like with even less power than the Pope. The emperor really is supposed to be more or less ceremonial. On the other hand, the warlords, the aristocrats, the peasants, everybody is supposed to sort of venerate the emperor, and that veneration is for the most part genuine, but the emperor has very little, hard power. The emperor's, power, if he has any power, is more influence. So, who actually wields power? Well, now it's the Minamoto clan. And in 1192, they establish the first shogunate. So the position of Saitai Shogun in Japanese basically means barbarian expelling supreme commander, which is a great thing to put on a resume, I guess. So we just abbreviate that to, or shorten that to Shogun, who is more or less the military dictator of Japan. So the term that we use for the shogunate government is the bakufu. The bakufu government basically means, or bakufu in Japanese basically means tent. The idea is that in this sort of tent, metaphorical tent, all political power is supposed to be gathered and subordinated to the shogun. The emperor and the court remain, but the Minamoto family and their retainers and samurai, more on them in just a bit, they're the ones who actually have real control over the shogunate, or in the shogunate. So the establishment of the emperor as a figurehead basically means we see an end to the dream of centralized government, and we see the imposition of feudalism. So let's sort of talk about what feudalism looks like. So just like in European feudalism, you have regional lords that are basically warlords, bushi, and these administer small kingdoms, fiefs, they collect taxes, and they also have private armies. Eventually, these bushi will be called by a different name, the daimyo. You'll see references to them on the next slide. So their retainers, their professional soldiers, were called samurai. So it's important to kind of remember that the idea of the samurai that we sort of see in like movies and films and that and TV shows and video games, that's really more of a creation of the 19th century. And I'll sort of explain what that means. So in the 19th century, well, actually starting more like in the 1600s of the 17th century, you have an end of another civil war that we'll talk about. And after the end of that civil war, the samurai really had nothing to do. So they spent the next 200 years basically mythologizing how awesome they were back in the day. How they fought to the very end, how they never surrendered, how they never ran away. And the reality is that samurai ran away quite a bit, actually, in the civil wars that Japan fought. Samurais were mythologized as being, loyal to their lord to the very end, which is why so many samurai in real history actually killed their lords. Samurais were, very effective warriors, but, warriors just like any other social class of warriors that you see. The Japanese do have sort of their own version of the chivalric code called the Code of Bushido, which stresses family honor and ritualistic suicide rather than accept defeat or even shame. The samurai were salaried, which did encourage a certain degree of loyalty to their daimyo. The serfs, the peasants, they basically are treated almost as the property of the local lord, and they could be executed or punished for even the most tiny of infractions, not bowing with sufficient speed to a social superior, for example. So what's interesting, though, is that both peasants and samurai start turning to Buddhism, but for very different reasons. So peasants sort of turn to Buddhism as almost, the promise of a release, the idea of salvation through nirvana. The samurai turn to Buddhism because it offers them sort of a way to abandon, just to be honest, some of the trauma and the misgivings of a military life. It sort of helps them overcome their misgivings about killing, that sort of thing. So Buddhism becomes increasingly popular in Japan. So a couple of more notes about the samurai. One, the idea of samurai all running around with katanas, these little sort of curved long swords, that's not really quite accurate. The samurai were first, interestingly, developed as mounted sort of horse archers, not unlike the horse archers that the Mongolians will use. Basically, they run against or run into a tribe in the northern parts of Japan, and these natives basically use highly mobile horse archers, and basically the samurai arguably sort of emerge as a response to that. One limiting factor there is, believe it or not, the horses in Japan tend to be quite small. In fact, there's some debate as to whether or not samurai could actually charge into battle because the horses were, again, very, very small. So, typically most samurai fought on foot, but mostly they were armed with spears like yaris or naginatas, not necessarily primarily armed with katanas. Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at the feudal social structure that we've basically been talking about this entire time. You have the shogun and the emperor at the top of the hierarchy, but again, they're not really equal in practice. The emperor still holds court in Heian / Kyoto. The shogun holds court in Kamakura, which is, of course, why we call this the Kamakura Shogunate. But underneath the shogun, you have daimyo, these regional warlords. Some of them could be incredibly powerful. Some of them could be, basically just in control of a few villages or two. But these were all lords that had their own independent power base. Both the shogun and the daimyo also have armies of samurai. And the samurai are directly paid by their lords. They get a salary. Beyond that, though, you have peasants and artisans. They're sort of second from the bottom, and then you have merchants at the very, very bottom. So you do see some overlap with Chinese social hierarchy. You see the low status of merchants, but you don't really see the bureaucracy anywhere, because for the most part, that's kind of gone. In the 14th century, in other words, the 1300s, you almost have kind of a warring states period within Japan. The power of the emperor was weakened, but also the shogunate was weakened through small-scale rebellions, civil wars, lack of support. And so you get this sort of endemic period of violence where civil wars are raging between the aristocratic families. And during this time period, those bushi vassals that we talked about start to acquire more land. Then the land is further subdivided among the samurai in exchange for loyalty. Again, very, very similar to Western feudalism. So you do have court rebellions that continue, and Japan more or less divides into 300 small kingdoms led by daimyos. And those daimyos, again, start to develop their own independent power bases, even independently from that of the shogun. Nonetheless, we do see some degree of greater organization in Japan. You see taxes are collected to fund public works projects like irrigation and roads, but the overall picture is, again, a decline of overall centralization. So feudal Japan was, a pretty violent place. The short-lived centralization of the Minamoto shogunate was also coinciding with almost like the heyday of Bushido and that, code of honor. But as these civil wars and rebellions continue, let's just say that the behavior code also deteriorates as well. So you get lots of social change, you have violence between social classes, and even though the samurai are still the dominant military class, the reality is that warfare still turns on the raising of large numbers of poorly trained peasant troops called ashigaru. So you also see the widespread construction of castles, just like in the Middle Ages. These are not as strong as European stone forts, but it's interesting that in this age of intrigue, you would have elaborate defenses and detection systems that could warn daimyo or shoguns of potential assassins. So there's one castle in particular where if an assassin stepped on a floor panel, the song of birds would apparently ring out, which would alert the lord that somebody is about to stabby him. So what we see with the emergence of the daimyo is we see almost the emergence of like 300 semi-independent states. So we were talking about the fact that the emperors basically noped out of dealing with the Chinese, especially during the Tang Dynasty. Well, with the rise of the daimyo, you actually have all of these independent states who are only too keen to trade directly with the Chinese, but also more than the Chinese. It is that sort of open system, by the way, that will eventually lead to trade in Japan between the Japanese and the Europeans. So the dominant economic system was still agriculture, specifically rice cultivation. But you see the emergence of standardized currency, an increase in guilds, and also you have this interesting religious system where Shinto and Zen Buddhism exist simultaneously. Remember, Shintoism is basically traditional Japanese religion that revolves around emperor veneration and ancestor worship. Japan really didn't have any external opponents to worry about, and most of its conflicts were ultimately internal, with one critical exception. And of course, it's always the exception, the emergence of the Mongols. And next time when we talk about Japan, we will talk about Japan and the divine wind. Till next time.